China increasingly targets its critics overseas. Last summer, the family of a Chinese dissident was accused of making bomb threats they said they had nothing to do with.
I think the Chinese government is treating us so badly to show its power.
But was it the Communist Party? We unravel the mystery on the latest episode of The Sunday Story on NPR's Up First podcast.
What's good? You're listening to Code Switch. I'm Gene Demby. So obviously, the big news in the country this week, I don't know if you heard, was that Joe Biden dropped his campaign to be re-elected president.
So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation.
Biden's re-election bid was listing badly because of concerns over his age that were just getting louder. And when he stepped down, he endorsed his current vice president, Kamala Harris. So this is where we put all the obvious stuff. If Harris were to win, she would be the first woman and the first Asian person and the first black woman in the Oval Office. And a lot of folks are very excited about that possibility for a lot of reasons. They see her as tough, a powerful speaker.
You know, as many of you know, before I was elected as vice president, before I was elected as United States Senator, I was the elected Attorney General, as I've mentioned, of California. And before that, I was a courtroom prosecutor. In those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds.
And some people like the prospect of a former prosecutor going up against Donald Trump, who was recently convicted of dozens of felonies.
Predators who abused women. Fraudsters who ripped off consumers. Cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
We're just going to dog ear that prosecutor thing real quick. We're going to come back to it. Just hold that thought. Now that Harris has been the vice president for the past 3.5 years, she has consistently polled uncommonly poorly for a sitting vice president, although those numbers will and already have bumped up now that she's the presumptive Democratic nominee. Some people say her weak polling numbers were because she was handed the hot potato issue of immigration and the border.
That the goal of our work is to help Guatemalans find hope at home. At the same time, I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come.
That comment and her work on the border has come back to haunt her. Now, other people have chalked up her unpopularity to her being a woman of color, a black woman, who was always probably going to set off a lot of people's alarm bells.
We've got a DEI hire in here, and Biden said, first off, he said he's going to hire a black female for vice president, and that he just skipped over. What about white females? What about any other group? It just, when you go down that route, you take mediocrity, and that's what they have right now as a vice president.
Whatever the reasons are for her polling numbers, though, Democrats are hoping that the fact that she's still kind of a blank slate for a lot of people means that Kamala Harris is nowhere near the ceiling of her potential popularity, if I can mix metaphors. But they've got, look at the election is on November 5th, I'm just looking at the calendar. They got fewer than 12 weeks to prove that theory correct. I mean, no pressure, none. With all that in mind, we figured we should revisit some of our own coverage here on Code Switch of Kamala Harris from back in 2020, just to help fill out the picture a little bit. Back then, Kamala Harris found herself in a very tricky political spot. So she had spent much of her career as a prosecutor, and she had made it a prominent part of her Senate campaign and her political identity.
And I now stand before you as the top cop of the biggest state in the country. No offense, Eric Schneiderman.
And then she had to navigate this moment when millions of people were giving fresh attention to racism in America's criminal legal system. And it's worth trying to just put some context around when and how she came up, right? So when Kamala Harris was starting her legal career, the United States was a much more dangerous place to live. New York City, for example, had 2,245 homicides in 1990. Whew. Last year in 2023, In a city with a larger population, New York City had 386. But it was in that context of all that violent crime in the 1980s and 1990s and the crack epidemic that a lot of people had a lot of time for tough on crime rhetoric. And a lot of people ran for political office on that platform. But the violence of that time and the overwhelming political and criminal justice response to it all, it fell hardest on Black people and Black neighborhoods. But a related thread to that post-civil rights moment in the 1980s and early 1990s was that record numbers of Black folks were going to college and entering into the professional world, people like Kamala Harris. It was the era of the Huxtables, of Black ambition as Black uplift. Big cities around the country were electing their first Black mayors, and while back then the idea of a Black president still seemed like science fiction or the premise of a comedy sketch, there were new avenues opening up for Black aspiration. So if you were a young Black lawyer who wanted to hold political office, one stepping stone to City Hall or some other coveted post was to become a prosecutor. Locking up dangerous elements in a Black neighborhood, that was not exactly a hard sell. But the mechanics of crime and punishment in Black neighborhoods and cities was always deeply classed, and it remains so. Educated professionals like Black judges and prosecutors in a lot of Black cities, they were doing the locking up. It was poor Black folks who were the ones being locked up. Some people got long careers, some people got long sentences. Harris's early career as a law student and as a prosecutor was set against all these threads. And she, like so many Black politicos and judges and even police officers of her generation, saw her work as taking up the mantle of the civil rights revolution. She said this countless times. And that's where my former co-host, Shireen Marisol Meraji, and I jumped in. This is from an episode we put out in 2020, and it begins with Harris reading from her memoir.
My parents often brought me in a stroller with them to civil rights marches. I have young memories of a sea of legs moving about, of the energy and the shouts and the chants. Social justice was a central part of family discussions. My mother would laugh, telling a story she loved about the time when I was fussing as a toddler. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to soothe me. "Freedom!" I yelled back.
That is an excerpt from the audiobook The Truths We Hold by Kamala Harris.
That book came out last year, and it's one of those campaign autobiographies that, come out every time somebody's running for a race. You get those little folksy stories that are supposed to tell us something about the candidate's values, the truths they hold or whatever.
Yeah, and they rarely tell us anything too juicy or too chewy,
Right.
I personally wanted more drama, less, oh, shucks, isn't that sweet? But you can probably learn a lot from how they choose to tell their origin stories.
And as we just heard, Kamala Harris cast her childhood as directly downstream from the civil rights movement. Her parents were both professors who moved to the Bay in the 1960s, and she said they fell in with the Black community there, and in particular, some community-minded, politically engaged people, protesters and organizers. And as we heard, Tiny Kamala was right along with them.
And as we know, Tiny Kamala eventually grows up, goes to Howard University in Washington, D.C. in the 1980s.
Which she doesn't talk about in the book, but that was during the height of the crack era, we should just note.
And then in 1986, she comes back to the Bay for law school, and she decides she wants to be a prosecutor.
Right. And in her book, she says that when she told her people back home that she wanted to be a prosecutor, they were not thrilled.
There's the drama.
Yeah.
I knew quite well that equal justice was an aspiration, not yet an achievement. I knew that the force of the law was applied unevenly, sometimes by design. And I wanted to be a part of changing that.
But Kamala Harris says she very much saw being a prosecutor as an extension of all that marching that her mother and her play-aunts and her neighbors that they were doing in the 1960s.
I knew part of making change was what I'd seen all my life, surrounded by adults shouting and marching and demanding justice from the outside. But I also knew there was an important role on the inside, sitting at the table where the decisions are being made. When activists came marching and banging on the doors, I wanted to be on the other side to let them in.
You were hearing Kamala Harris's voice, but we didn't get a chance to talk to Kamala Harris because her people did not respond to our request to talk to us for this episode. Anyway, in her book, she wrote, the people who wanted to be protected from discrimination and injustice also wanted to be protected from crime. And so in the first stop in her career, she was a local prosecutor in Oakland, Shireen's old stomping grounds. After a few years, she gets recruited to take a job across the bay dealing with serial offender cases in the San Francisco DA's office. And so she takes that job. And she said the DA's office was a mess. Everything was disorganized, which is why she said the office was not securing enough convictions.
Shade. I heard that shade.
So she says, I should run for this office myself against my boss. So she campaigned for San Francisco DA. And she won that race in a runoff. So it was 2003, just 13 years into her legal career, and Kamala Harris had already become the first black DA in the history of one of the nation's most economically important and politically specific cities.
Especially then. Yeah, the Bay is complicated. It's a very complicated place. It's not the kind of place where people love prosecutors.
This is San Francisco, so everybody is somewhere on the progressive spectrum.
Exactly. Who is that?
That is Jamila King.
I am the race and justice reporter at Mother Jones and also host of the Mother Jones podcast.
Jamila is from the Bay, like Kamala and like you, spiritually, Shireen. She wrote a piece for Mother Jones last year called The Secret to Understanding Kamala Harris, which is good for us because that's what we're trying to do. And she took a long look at Kamala Harris's career from her beginnings as a prosecutor to holding statewide office as a senator. And she said Harris's politics were pretty much in line with a lot of the progressive orthodoxies of San Francisco.
But she's definitely more on the moderate end of this progressive spectrum. And what that means is she talks a lot about bringing law and order to the streets. She talks a lot about sort of this old school sort of, I consider it like the black folks in the neighborhood who are like, well, if they would just go to school and pull up their pants. I mean, she never said pull up their pants. But, we know that rhetoric, right? If we can just give people the resources that they need to engage meaningfully in society, they'll do it. But there was definitely this strain of personal responsibility that ran throughout what she was proposing. So she was running as a progressive, but she was a moderate progressive.
She ran as someone who was opposed to the death penalty.
Which makes sense because it's San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. Yep. But she also ran as kind of like a law and order, tough on crime prosecutor who was going to lock up more people and secure more convictions.
And that is a little unusual.
And that stance actually won over the police union. They really dug that, so they endorsed her in that runoff for DA. One of her signature programs after she became DA was this initiative, she called it a personal responsibility program, called Back on Track. She thought of it as an alternative to incarceration. And to participate in the Back on Track program, people had to plead guilty to their charges.
So that conviction went on their records.
Mm-hmm. But it would come off their records with the stipulation that they complete this, personal responsibility reentry and training program.
And the program consisted of everything under the sun. So it was an internship program, which is how I sort of first heard of it. And it was, if you needed counseling, if you needed job preparation, if you needed resume help.
How many people took part in this Back on Track program?
So the numbers that I found showed that there were only a few hundred people who completed the program, like 241 or so completed the program between 2007 and 2011. So it was a pretty small program. But even though it was small, Kamala Harris and other people in San Francisco touted that it was really effective in reducing recidivism. And they talked about it as a model for how other cities across the country could do this. Not long after she took office, though, something else happened. And it led her to take a really politically risky stance.
So in 2004, a few months after Kamala Harris takes office, there's a shooting in Baby Hunters Point, which is a predominantly black working class neighborhood in San Francisco, in which a young police officer named Isaac Espinosa is shot and killed.
At the time of that shooting, there had not been a police officer killed in San Francisco in decades. And Harris said early on that she was not going to go for the death penalty in the case of the person who killed Officer Espinosa. And her decision to not seek the death penalty made a lot of noise. It got a lot of attention. The San Francisco Chronicle combed through the records and said that it was basically unprecedented for a prosecutor in California, or anywhere else in the country for that matter, to not seek the death penalty in a case in which a cop was killed.
I can imagine that law enforcement was not pleased about that.
Not at all. They were not. Rank-and-file officers, the police union that had endorsed her, they were all livid. But Kamala Harris stuck to her guns. Here's Jamila again.
She published an op-ed in the San Francisco Chronicle where she laid out a very compelling case and said very explicitly that she didn't want to support the death penalty, or she didn't support the death penalty because it was racist. And she laid out all the evidence for it.
Harris's position was capital punishment is unjustly applied along racial lines. And the idea that it's a deterrent to crime is basically not backed up by any facts. But these are arguments that are not beyond the pale in San Francisco, right? But the people in law enforcement and all the people who support people in law enforcement, Harris's decision to not go after this cop's killer, that was an affront to justice.
The fallout from that decision seems to have stayed with Kamala Harris, even as she kept rising in profile and rising in power.
Please welcome to the podium the Honorable California Attorney General, Kamala Davy Harris.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
In 2010, Kamala Harris ran for Attorney General of California. And as you just heard, she won.
2010 was around the time a lot of people outside of California started hearing Kamala Harris's name. She found herself in charge of the largest attorney general's office anywhere in the United States. The only one that's bigger is the U.S. Attorney General, and everyone started speculating about what her next move might be.
Yeah, she won that race, but it was really close. She was actually an underdog in it, and that was because of her opposition to the death penalty. So some of her San Francisco politics, they were not going to fly statewide. So Jamila says, as Attorney General of California, she started to put some daylight between some of her old stances as District Attorney of San Francisco.
Which stances?
So as District Attorney of San Francisco, she declined to pursue the death penalty. As Attorney General of California, she defended the state's use of the death penalty. So essentially, she was just like, look, I'm doing my job.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is basically I'm opposed to the death penalty, but it's the state's prerogative.
Right. A few years ago, when it looked like Kamala Harris might enter the presidential race, I interviewed an organizer, a Black woman involved in the Black Lives Matter movement in California. She had had confrontations and meetings with Harris before. She had pushed Harris, who was the Attorney General, obviously, to look into the police shooting of an unarmed Black man. And Kamala Harris's office declined to do that. And this organizer told me, like, look, point blank, Kamala Harris is not interested in big systemic changes. Harris, she often, stayed away from controversial issues, and that her policies were smaller and more specific than they were sweeping.
Hence, back on track.
Right, exactly. And that's a criticism a lot of people have had of her over her career. When the LA Times, who endorsed her for Senate, did so, they said, she was thoughtful and pragmatic. And they were kind of worried that she played things too safe, that she avoided commenting on messy issues, specifically when those issues involved police reform.
Well, yeah, because she had personal experience having law enforcement be very, very upset with her. It's hard not to think that she might have, not been trying to piss off the cops once again.
Exactly. But, part of the story she tells about herself is that she cares about these issues specifically. Something else that organizer told me, though, was that she felt like she could work with Kamala Harris, which is what Jamila King found, too.
I'm from San Francisco. I know folks who've, been in the system, and they'll just say flat out, look, like, she's a cop. I'm not trying to mess with that. On the other hand, what's always been really telling for me is that there are a lot of folks within San Francisco's criminal justice reform system, a lot of organizers, a lot of community groups that are pretty ride or die for her. Like, they don't agree necessarily with all of the decisions she's made, but they recognize that she was one of the few people to even give them a seat at the table.
And that right there is a callback to what we heard earlier in Kamala's book, where she says she wanted to be the one to open the door to let activists in.
Right. The person making change from the inside.
Looking back at her record, it's really hard to figure out Senator Harris. She's navigating tricky territory. You know, the tools you have as a prosecutor involve locking people up or at least wielding the threat of putting people behind bars.
Right, exactly. So there are all these things about her record as a prosecutor, as a politician, regardless of whether you're a fan of hers, that require so many caveats.
Which brings us to Kamala Harris's identity. She's a Black woman who grew up in a progressive Black city, Oakland, California. That has to play a role in our politics, right? How can it?
Right. We want her identity to tell us something about the way she feels about the world. Instead, and when I was talking to Jamila King of Mother Jones, she said something that really stuck with me, that I found really illuminating.
And I don't want to speculate about how Kamala Harris has come into her racial identity, but I'm going to do it anyway. So, you know, like she talks a lot about being the daughter of immigrants. She talks a lot about, you know, growing up sort of in the shadow of the civil rights movement. She doesn't necessarily talk about, you know, growing up sort of in the backyard of the Black Panthers. Like for instance, I'm in Oakland right now. The former headquarters of the Black Panther Party is literally like around the corner, right? So I think these were really palpable, visible signs when she was growing up. But, you know, she's the daughter of two professors. And, you know, she also went to Howard. And no shade, but she's an AKA.
The AKAs, Alpha Kappa Alpha Incorporated, are the oldest, the first Black sorority in the U.S. And they have a reputation of being bougie and respectable.
You know, and love them. I have many AKAs in my life who I love and adore dearly. However, they are not the folks showing up in like naturals with fists raised, you know, like trying to beat down the system. I think it's very much a political ideology built on being twice as good. It's built on showing up in the crispest suit. And, you know, one of the quotes that her mother said that I found so interesting was during her first run, when she was sort of this out-of-the-box candidate, her mother gave an interview to a Bay Area reporter and was basically like, you know, oh, she can definitely hang with all these people. She knows which forks to use at the dinner party.
So she grew up in the shadow of Black radicalism, but does not claim that. She's not a radical. She became part of a burgeoning post-civil rights Black elite. In fact, that's a big part of the story here, because her life and her career track with two enormously consequential phenomena over the last 4 decades. The rise of a large Black professional class, a Black political elected class on one hand, and the rise of mass incarceration on the other.
And I'm just going to be Captain Obvious here and say those two realities have shaped Black people's lives in this country in completely different ways.
We've talked before on this podcast about big divides among Black people, ethnic divides, generational divides, the divide between Black Democrats and Black Republicans.
Between Black Republicans and Black Republicans.
Yes. But Kamala Harris's career sits at the nexus of these other divides around class and status that maybe we don't talk about enough. So maybe whether you're willing to extend Kamala Harris the benefit of the doubt or whether you're skeptical of her record is about how you feel about all of these things. Black aspiration, of course, but also whether you feel like institutions like schools and the courts provided you with a pathway to a career or a pathway to incarceration, or whether you feel like an insider or an outsider. Insiders like Kamala Harris, they get a seat at the table. And like her mom said, they know which forks to use. But that also means that they're rarely the ones interested in flipping that table over.
And she's a reformer. Like, she makes no bones about that.
Here's Jamila King one last time.
She is here to make our punitive systems more just, but she's not trying to disrupt them entirely. That's never been her forte. I think that's an important quality to have when everything is shifting so quickly, right? And especially when, you have a Democratic Party that is sort of all on the same page around getting rid of Donald Trump, but that's kind of the only thing that everyone agrees on. So I think it's important that, she have certain people at the table. I think it's important to know that the political moment will change her. And it also kind of goes the other way, right? Say, 3 years from now, we enter an era in which really punitive policies come back, right? And it's deeply conservative. Will she be swayed the other way, right? So, it's worrying, definitely, for a lot of activists that I've talked to, but I also hear from them that, if this is the ticket, they want to have as much influence as they can, and she at least gives them an audience.
So that last thought from Jamila King, that was from a conversation we had in 2020. And here we are, 4 years later. And I think that question is still very top of mind for a lot of people. Like, how will today's political landscape shape Kamala Harris's policies and the decisions she makes? Like, what will she lean into as someone who is about to run against Donald Trump? And how will the general public metabolize her as she weighs in on everything from the ongoing bombardment of Gaza to, U.S. border policy, to the tax code? There's just so much to watch. And we are definitely going to be revisiting these questions on the podcast in the coming months. But we will have more on Kamala Harris, including how her South Asian identity plays into her political career after a short break.
I mean, she's been this person and in this nation and aware of these dynamics for her whole life.
That's coming up.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Wise, the app that makes managing your money in different currencies easy. With Wise, you can send and spend money internationally at the mid-market exchange rate. No guesswork and no hidden fees. Learn more about how Wise could work for you at wise.com.
It's a high-stakes election year, so it's not enough to just follow along. You need to understand what's happening so you are fully informed come November. Every weekday on the NPR Politics Podcast, our political reporters break down important stories and backstories from the campaign trail so you understand why it matters to you. Listen to the NPR Politics Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Christian nationalists want to turn America into a theocracy, a government under biblical rule. If they gain more power, it could mean fewer rights for you. I'm Heath Drusen, and on the new season of Extremely American, I'll take you inside the movement. Listen to Extremely American from Boise State Public Radio, part of the NPR network.
New from the Embedded podcast.
I hereby declare the House of Representatives of the 113th General Assembly of the State of Tennessee now in session.
What happens when three moms set out to change the way state politics work?
We are smart and we are swift. We are not going anywhere.
Listen to Supermajority from NPR's Embedded and WPLN. All episodes out now.
Hey, I'm Robert Smith from Planet Money, and this summer we are bringing you the entire history of the world, at least the economics part. It's Planet Money Summer School. Every week, we'll invite in a brilliant professor and play classic episodes about the birth of money, banks, and finance. There will be rogues and revolutionaries and a lot of panics. Summer School, every Wednesday till Labor Day on the Planet Money podcast from NPR.
Gene on this one. Code switch. So we were just talking about the nuances of Kamala Harris's identity as a black woman, coming up in the wake of the civil rights movement and straddling these very different strains of thought about how to continue that civil rights work. Well, now we're turning to a different part of her identity. As most people, I think, know at this point, Kamala Harris is both black and South Asian. Her mother is an Indian American immigrant, a Brahmin, so at the top of the caste system. And on another episode of the podcast that aired in 2020, we talked about how Kamala Harris's biracial identity and her Indian heritage contributed to how people understood her. So you're about to hear a couple different voices from this conversation. In a second, you're going to hear from Natasha Sharma. Natasha is a professor of Black Studies and Asian American Studies at Northwestern University. But first, you're going to hear from Kumari Devarajan, who is a former Code Switch producer and who, as it happens, is also biracial and South Asian.
One of the things I was curious about was why did it take her becoming the VP candidate for the media and the rest of the U.S. to really take notice of her Indian heritage?
Right, because when she was still running for president, most people saw her as just black.
That is not necessarily a negative thing. That's how she self-identifies as well. She is a black woman. She was, born and raised in Oakland, California, and she grew up in the 60s, and she knew people who founded the Black Studies departments, and she was around the civil rights and Black nationalist movements in the Bay Area. She went to a historically Black university and college, right? So that's the way race operates in the United States.
Yeah, on our last episode about Kamala Harris, we focused on how her politics fit in with Black political thought about policing throughout the 90s and the 2000s. And a lot of people see her as part of that particular political scene and judge her accordingly.
And that definitely has to do with how she's positioned herself. But it also has to do with something really important about how race works.
We don't like to think about people as more than one race. It's more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I spoke to Jackie Chen, who is an assistant professor of social psychology at the University of Utah. She studies perceptions of multiracial people and specifically perceptions of their loyalty.
Loyalty, yes. I know a little something about that. People always perceive me as much more loyal to my Puerto Rican side at the expense of loyalty to my Iranian side.
And Jackie found that Black people and Asian people tend to think about loyalty super differently.
Essentially, what we find is that among Black Americans, there is a broad acceptance of biracial people, or more broadly, people with part Black ancestry.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, Frederick Douglass, Bob Marley, right? Like, there are all sorts of very well-known Black people with white parents whose Blackness is taken as a given. Barack Obama, because Blackness has always had to operate that way.
Well, there's that rule of hypodescent, or the one-drop rule, which most of us know about. During slavery, if you had any Black ancestry, you were legally Black, and that was to increase the number of people that could be enslaved.
Homer Plessy, the dude behind Plessy versus Ferguson, right? The dude who was the plaintiff in that case, was 1/8 Black.
Yeah. Yep. So that's exactly what Jackie said.
Certainly, there's a lot of precedent for part Black multiracials being denied any choice in their identity and having to be Black. Nowadays, although biracial people are given more choices in their identities, people and Black Americans tend to think, well, Black, white, biracials probably share these experiences of discrimination that really define the Black experience in America. And because we have these shared experiences, we have this common fate. We have this link.
So that linked experience with Black people makes multiracial folks more likely to be included in Black communities, to being viewed by other Black folks as Black folks.
But that is not how it works for all racial groups.
Jackie says that for Asian Americans, it's the complete opposite.
There's kind of a break with Asian Americans and Asian white biracials, where Asian Americans say, hey, you're not really discriminated against, and I bet you want to identify as white, and I bet you wouldn't be loyal to the Asian in-group. So I think that you're not one of us. You're not Asian. You don't get it.
Jackie says this is because many Asians don't agree on whether or not they're discriminated against in the first place. She said some believe we experience racism and others don't. So this idea of having a linked fate based on discrimination is already kind of shaky. And then when you add biracial people, there's less a sense of we all have something in common.
Jackie is referring here specifically to Asian and white biracials and Black and white biracials. What about people who don't have a white parent?
So you're right, Shireen. Jackie's research only focused on Asian white and Black white biracials. And then among Asians, she actually only focused on East Asian, which makes it kind of difficult to make assumptions about how this phenomenon is working on Kamala Harris. But Natasha Sharma, the expert we heard from earlier, she said that you can see a similar thing happening with Kamala Harris.
She was raised in a Black community in Oakland that clearly knew she was South Asian because her mom, who often wore saris, because she raised her there. And they nonetheless embraced her.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, because even though, you know, her biraciality would have been obvious because, you know, her mom was walking around Oakland in a sari, it seems like the Black folks in her neighborhood in Oakland would have just been like, yeah, you live over here with us, you get bused to school with us, you Black. It's not that complicated.
And Natasha says the fact that Kamala Harris is biracial and the fact that she is Black might have made it harder for South Asians to accept her.
Meaning that she would probably have a very different experience within a predominantly Indian American community. You know, she might face racism, anti-Black racism by aunties and uncles who might tell her to stay out of the sun and things like that my dad told me, right?
Oh, yeah. I've heard that a lot growing up.
Yeah, me too. And the truth is, we don't know how it would have turned out if she had grown up in a more heavily South Asian community.
And to be fair, we know Kamala Harris was close to her Indian family. She traveled to India growing up. She kept in touch with her mother's siblings over the phone and through letters. But, you know, being close with your family and being accepted by a broader community, if you're a biracial person, as Shireen will tell you, those are two different things.
Okay, so we've been talking about how Kamala Harris's individual communities accept her or don't accept her or maybe accept her, but it's totally different when you're on a national stage.
I thought about my mother, who came to the United States at the age of 19.
Yeah, and probably our closest reference point for a multiracial person with a similar status is Barack Obama.
My own story. I'm the son of a black man from Kenya and a white woman from Kansas.
Do we need to say probably? He is,
Yes, that's him.
Yeah.
It's Mr. Obama. And we have about 10 years of evidence showing how President Obama's racial identity was picked apart. Like, what is he really?
And even Obama faced, sort of all sorts of stuff around his blackness and his racial identity, right? Like, a lot of conservatives would start bringing up the fact that he was half black, as a way to sort of being like, oh, black people can't claim credit for his presidency. People also forget that he had to give a whole ass speech in 2008 when he was running for president, in which he had to basically allay white people's fears that he was a scary black man. He had to distance himself from his pastor. Oh, man, it was a whole thing.
Yep. And that then led to complaints that he was trying way too hard to distance himself from his blackness, talking too much about his white mom, his white grandparents from Kansas.
Yet when Illinois Senator Barack Obama announced his bid for president, it set off a national debate that escaped his predecessors. A debate about being black enough.
It used to be like nobody knew that he was mixed, but...
His last name rhymed with Osama. His middle name was Hussein. Racially, he was half white and half
yes, you're the first African-American president, but your mother was white.
By the time of our mock election, Obama had already gone from our first mixed-race president to our first black president.
And so there's a suspicion that people who have African ancestry and white ancestry, if you're raised by a white parent and a black parent and you identify as both or talk about your white parent, there's sort of this idea that you're running away from blackness, that you are trying to be anything but black.
And I know that we said earlier that the black community was super accepting of Kamala Harris, but getting back to now she's on the national stage, this big time spotlight is on her, that can possibly change things. Kamala Harris did get some pushback about her blackness or her lack thereof. Last year, Washington Post senior critic at large Robin Givhan wrote about how some black people look to Kamala Harris's white husband or look to her record as a prosecutor as things pulling her away from her blackness, along with the fact that she also grew up surrounded by a lot of white people because her parents were a part of the Ivory Towers.
When we change those dynamics to talking about someone who is black and Indian, and she's talking about her Indian mother who raised her, there's a little more willingness to understand, okay, she's not necessarily running away from blackness. She's not trying to aspire to whiteness or access white privilege. And so the dynamics are a little different. And so the suspicion might be temporarily put to the side to kind of listen, oh, what does it mean to be raised by an Indian mother in the Bay Area in the 60s, right? And that's a little different than the approaches to Obama.
But there's something else that she has to deal with that Obama never had to deal with. Kamala Harris is a woman.
Wait, what?
I know. Breaking news. She's black, she's Indian, she's a woman. So she has to be really careful when it comes to maneuvering around stereotypes that intersect with all of these identities.
You've got the loud and angry black woman stereotype.
And then a different stereotype when it comes to Asian women.
Asian womanhood, Asian American women are conceptualized as being quiet, submissive, right? As dominated by, right, the white man.
Okay, but if a lot of Americans didn't even know, or if it wasn't registering to them that Kamala Harris is South Asian, the pressure of not having to be too submissive, that might not be too big of a deal, right?
Right, but then again, she's on stage in front of all of America, so it's really tricky.
It's tricky, but then I'm like, she has a lifetime of experience, right? I mean, she's been this person and in this nation and aware of these dynamics forever, for her whole life.
What's so bananas is that we've never had someone like her as a vice president, who comes from multiple communities and shares multiple marginalized identities. Which leads me to the question, who gets to claim her?
On the one hand, there were a lot of memes and responses to when she said, I'm speaking, right?
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
I have to
I'm
weigh
speaking.
in.
Where black women were saying, right, this is the experience of every Black woman speaking, right, and being spoken over. Then there were sort of Black women academics who were saying this is every Black woman at a Black faculty meeting. Then there were women of color who were saying this is every woman of color speaking at a faculty meeting. And then there were sort of white women who were saying this is every woman speaking at a faculty meeting.
So I'm hearing Natasha say that all women can claim Kamala Harris.
Well, but then there were debates among these folks, right, saying, well, this is not every white woman. This is every woman of color. And then people even more specified, no, it's not every woman of color. This is about a Black woman.
So any woman who wants to claim her can, but there are limits. White women and non-Black women of color will never understand what it means to be a Black woman in America. And if you're claiming Kamala Harris by saying her experience is every woman's experience, you're overshadowing the obstacles Black women face when it comes to getting to the place Kamala Harris has, Vice President-elect.
But then again, you got to ask, would she have gotten where she is if there wasn't, light skin privilege at play, right? If her parents were not professors and she didn't have all the social capital and connections that came with that, if she wasn't half Indian and her parents weren't immigrants, all that stuff matters too, right?
Yeah. And as we can glean from VP-elect Kamala Harris, identity is about so much more than just adding up your census boxes. Here's Natasha Sharma again.
And I think that that's really key. We have to be able to see that people have racial identities and they're complicated and multiple and not always evident. And then we also have community. And for me, I create community based on people's political worldviews. That's my people. I don't really care what your background is ancestrally. Every person in the United States should know this at this point, that we have ancestry, we have the people who raised us, we have kin, we have fictive kin, the family we choose. We have work-based communities and communities that are based on shared interests. And those things don't overlap all the time.
And that's our show, y'all. You can find the full episodes that we aired in 2020 on the Code Switch podcast page. You can follow us on Instagram at NPR Code Switch. And if email is more your bag, ours is codeswitch@npr.org. Oh, yeah, and subscribe to the podcast on the NPR app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Code Switch newsletter, which is very dope, by going to npr.org/Code Switch newsletter. And just a reminder that signing up for Code Switch Plus is a great way to support our show and our team and public media, and you'll get to listen to every episode sponsor-free. So please go find out more at plus.npr.org/Code Switch. The episodes that we cobbled together to make this thing, they were originally produced by Kumari Devarajan, Leah Donnella, and Alyssa Baheza, and edited by Leah Donnella and Steve Drummond. The updates were produced by Jess Kung and edited by Leah Donnella and Courtney Stein. And we would be remiss if we did not shout out the rest of the Code Switch massive. That's Christina Calla, Xavier Lopez, Dalia Mortada, Verilyn Wims, B.A. Parker, and Lori Lizarraga. As for me, I'm Gene Demby. Be easy.
How does the brain process memories? Why is AI a solution and a problem for our climate? What is leadership in 2025 and beyond? The TED Radio Hour explores the biggest questions and the most complicated ideas of our time with the world's greatest thinkers. Listen now to the TED Radio Hour from NPR.
If you think the economy makes no sense right now,
you are probably right, because even economists can't explain it lately.
But our podcast, The Indicator from Planet Money,
we're a little dose of clarity on the biggest economic questions of the day.
And about the forces that affect your life.
In 10 minutes or less every weekday, The Indicator from Planet Money from NPR.